Hi everybody, in this lecture we're going to talk about chapters 5 and 6, which include the upper class, or sometimes known as the superclass, and the middle class. So let's talk about the early years. Before banking and manufacturing, most affluent people had little actual money. They gained their wealth status from land, mansions, having livestock, jewels, carriages, and also owning slaves. So one example of that is Robert Carter of Westmoreland, Virginia. He's actually pictured on the right-hand side. This is Robert Carter the First. He owned over 300,000 acres of fine grazing land, more than 1,000 slaves, and he also owned an iron works, which is a place where iron is smelted or iron goods are made, a flour mill, and a renowned mansion, which is actually pictured on the right. Now, as time went on, Girard saves the day. So after the Revolutionary War, shipping became one of the greatest sources of wealth. Both before and after the war, the wealthy made money from the government contracts that they made with each other. So here from the beginning, even before the 18th century, the government and the wealthy were working together. In 1781, the Bank of the United States was founded to aid the new federal government in its wartime currency and debt management. So there was no structure or schedule in how the money or the debt was managed for the United States of America until 1781. Now, with that, rumors flew about who was receiving loans from the bank and actually controlling the bank itself. Were the wealthy people being too involved in what was happening with the bank? So Stephen Girard, who was a wealthy ship owner, actually blocked the bank's charter renewal and bought his own building and opened the Girard Bank. He was supported by the Madison administration, and all of the federal money was then transferred there. He is actually pictured on the right-hand side, and as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, there's actually a Girard College that is named after him. So let's talk about the Millionaires Club for a little bit. In the 1840s, there were around 150 to 200 millionaires, and most of them were located in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. The two that I have mentioned to the right are John Jacob Astor and Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, some of those last names may sound familiar, but something that was noted in the text is just because you're famous or rich doesn't mean that you are cultured, sophisticated, or even well-mannered. So one example that the text talks about was that arriving at a party, John Jacob Astor, the wealthiest man in New York City, greeted the hostess by wiping his hands on her dress. And Cornelius Vanderbilt, who replaced Astor as the city's most affluent individual, was seldom a guest at elegant parties because he constantly swore, spat, and manhandled the female servants. So you can see that just because you're rich doesn't mean you're necessarily well-mannered. So something that the text talks about then is when corporations start to form. So the corporate community is a number of large businesses and banks that form a network of such mutual benefits, such as sharing information, developing economic and political policies. So basically, the Millionaires Clubs start to hang out more together business-wise. The first corporate community was called the Boston Associates. It was established in 1845 by 80 men, and they controlled 31 of the textile companies, which made up about 20% of the textile business. So, think about today when you have a establishment of companies that work together. So think about shoes, for example. Nike was one of the hard hitters in the beginning. Reebok, Adidas. If they were to all come together to work together, then they would make up, probably 50% of the shoe business. And so that's kind of what the Boston Associates did with the textile business. Now, we talked about the Millionaires Club, but a lot of them came from humble beginnings to then become fabulously rich. So some would work their way up from poverty, some had not, and it showed that there was a high percentage that came from wealth and or prominent families. So John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, who are the pictures on the top, actually rose from humble beginnings and became fabulously rich, which is where I got that title. And so the Civil War allowed many people to cash in on their fortunes. So moving on, we're at the Civil War era. Some of the corporate and banking giants of the 1800s actually avoided soldiering by hiring substitutes for them. And this is where they began making their fortunes from railroads, iron, coal, and the oil industries, also including banking and other financial services that were developed to help with necessary business development. So, in order to run these major companies and corporations, there were other types of business that needed to be formed. These gentlemen were called the robber barons. Two other examples include J.P. Morgan and Jay Gould. Now, most of you, Carnegie, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, a lot of these different names sound familiar, right? So, J.D. Rockefeller became the country's first billionaire, and Andrew Carnegie was next in line with a $500 million fortune. Thanks to the absence of an income tax, it served the wealthy very well. So, Frederick Townsend Martin explained that he and his big business colleagues openly used their wealth and the politicians it could buy to protect their economic and political interests. These individuals would mobilize against any legislation, any political platform, and any presidential campaign that threatened the integrity of their estates. Now, the late 19th century was a time when the rich felt completely in control, sometimes called the Gilded Age, when their wealth was out and displayed for all to see. This caused the term conspicuous consumption to be created. This means lavish expenditures on high-priced goods and services in order to flaunt one's wealth. The next two slides will show some examples of this. So here's some examples where on the left-hand side we see, there's a nice car, there's a building, a pool, is it too much? But is it enough? Then you have the gentleman on the right-hand side smoking the cigar in his nice suit, nice car, just burning money, just letting you know that he has so much money that it doesn't matter if he burns it. On the right-hand side, this clip is actually from the Wolf of Wall Street movie. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it in regards to sociology perspectives. It's a fun one to watch and kind of analyze. So you can see he's just throwing money like it doesn't even matter. And then a little bit different, but kind of goes with the idea on the left-hand side, the Joker just lighting up a large amount of money. Here's some other examples. And on the left-hand side, this is actually pulled from The Great Gatsby. So, huge, lavish parties. You have a pool and a fountain inside of your house. And on the right-hand side, if any of you have ever seen the movie or know the comic Richie Rich, this is the mansion that his parents lived in. You can see the fancy office in the right-hand corner. And on the left-hand side, what their boardroom looks like. So his parents were very wealthy, and so that's something that they prominently showed to people. It was very outlandish. So each year, the government actually spends $815 billion in welfare to corporations and rich individuals, about 47% of what it takes yearly to run the federal government. So military waste, fraud, and incompetence, multinationals tax avoidance, low taxes on capital gains, accelerated depreciation, substantial subsidies of major industries, all of this can be found on page 126. And so this is something where, with that combination of relation with major wealthy individuals and corporations, the government then starts giving them this money. Now, however, in spite of this governmental support, many leading American corporations have recently struggled. So specifically in 2009, General Motors, Citigroup, Fannie Mae, Ford Motor Company, Time Warner, and ConocoPhillips were 6 of the 8 global corporations suffering the year's greatest losses. So it's important to realize that. So while the government has helped, let's go back to talking about the old rich versus the new rich. I'm on page 127. So, sociologist Botzel, a member of the upper class himself, described the old rich as groups of families descended from successful families of the previous or earlier generations. The old rich have a track record of established wealth, prominence, and respectability. They're brought up together, they're friends, they have a distinctive style of life, and a kind of primary group solidarity which sets them apart. So the contingent of wealthy peoples included the descendants of the major entrepreneurial families of the Industrial Revolution, the Rockefellers, the Fords, the Mellons, the DuPonts, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and others. So while there has been considerable variation in how individuals respond to being born into wealth and prominence, many feel comfortably settled at the top of the hierarchy. So some of you might wonder, why do I have pictures from the movie Titanic? Well, this is a great example, and I don't know how many of you have seen Titanic. If you have not seen Titanic, if you watch this movie with a sociological eye, it will blow your mind. I use this example a lot because it really does hit hard on that particular time period of the differences in social class and the way that people treat each other in regards to wealth and their socioeconomic status. So if you don't know the story, here's Rose Dawson, and this is her mother. Now, her mother had married rich. Well, after her father, so Rose's father, passed away, they lost most of the wealth and money that they had. So it was very important that her husband had still been alive in order for them to keep those funds. They lost a lot of their money. Well, they still boarded the Titanic on first class, very upper class, nice dresses, they had maids and servants. Here on the right-hand side, Cal is actually supposed to marry Rose. Now, Rose really doesn't love Cal, and she's really doing it just because her mother wants her to, because Cal comes from a wealthy family. So he's what we talked about with, the contingent of wealthy descendants. That was part of Cal's role. Now, on the left-hand side, there is a big difference, and there's actually a line in the movie where Rose's mom says that Molly Brown, who's listed here on the left-hand side with the big hat, is actually new money. She says that she's new money. So she has a different type of way that she speaks about Molly Brown, because she's not necessarily the old rich. She's not a descendant of an entrepreneur or, has been wealthy all of her life. She's considered the new rich. And so I love this picture on the bottom left-hand side of Rose and Cal. So most of you know the story of the Titanic. The Titanic hits an iceberg, the ship sinks. Rose loses her, considered lower class boyfriend Jack. When the Titanic sinks, Cal survives because he, fights off getting into a boat with these other women and children. And anyway, but the point is Rose actually, doesn't want to be associated with Cal, with the wealth. And so you can see here she's actually covered up. She's not dressed up. She doesn't want to be found by them. And when the people on the boat ask who she is so they can document it, she actually gives them a different name. And so that kind of goes with, not every individual responds to being born into wealth or being a part of wealth like Rose did compared to how Cal did. So one other example of the old rich is actually a upper class status organization that they have called the Social Register. And this was founded in 1886, and it has a membership of 25,000 people, including individuals who are descendants of the association's founding group. In order to join, families must obtain letters of recommendation from several active members, and then an advisory board evaluates the candidates on if they can join. So a couple other examples of the new rich that the text talks about is that most of them have obtained or all or most of their assets. Their sources of wealth have included computers, technology, business machines, oil drilling, real estate development, particularly in the Southwest, discount drugs and merchandising, fast food corporations, and insurance. The new rich tend to be more toned down than their Gilded Age counterparts. For instance, many major Wall Street operatives have forsaken the traditional business suit for what has become known as hedge fund casual, with open neck shirts and khakis. So, a little bit of a time gap from the pictures that I showed you of the old rich versus the new rich, but it does describe what you would see now as the new rich. So, a couple things before schooling the rich. I wanted to mention that upper class women emphasize the importance of nurturing their children's academic, social, and professional skills as foundation for success in adulthood, indicating it was a popular myth that the rich leave their children to the servants or the maids that work for them. David Rockefeller actually took his wife and children on many international trips so they could be well-rounded individuals. And so now, being well-rounded individuals, this influences the schooling that's established for rich children. These children's educations start in a prestigious preschool, and as teens, many attend high-class boarding schools, typically called prep schools. These are a fundamental building block in the upper class subculture. So this influences them not only academically but also socially. As the prep schools have expanded from dozens to hundreds, a distinct lifestyle has been formed, and they help students socially and become a source of social capital. So as you can see on the right hand side, I just wanted to find some fun examples for you of the Warblers from Glee. It's a prep school. And then on the bottom right hand side, some of you may notice the girls from the Facts of Life show. So while these elite schools' cultural tradition remains constant over time, changes have occurred in the student body, such as gender, race, and ethnic makeup. What were once all-male facilities are now co-ed, and a study of 18 very prestigious boarding schools indicated a steady increase in the number of African American students, with a nearly 10% growth between 1999 and 2003. So if you want to keep that statistic in your notes, check that out on page 132. So on page 133, 5 of the most acclaimed boarding schools in New England pledged to provide more financial aid and no longer reject students because of family income. So it's important, as I said, to realize that for these rich students, that boarding schools, since they're isolated from their families and outside friends, they develop close relationships with their classmates and teachers. They actually serve as surrogate families and sometimes call their school a second family. And it's important, as I said, that it becomes a source of social capital, but it can also become a source of business capital, because it's helpful when you move to a new city and you want to get invited into the local social club. It can become a source of that social capital. Now, not only is prep school experience important, but also studying at an elite college or university is important for an upper class individual's development. More advantageous socially and economically to have had a mediocre academic record at one of these schools listed, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, rather than to have been a Phi Beta Kappa at a less prominent college. So it's more important to the upper class individuals to get into one of these prestigious universities than it is to be mediocre somewhere else. The most prestigious 100 or so universities and colleges favor admittance for students whose parents have a history of giving them large donations. In addition, some schools show preferences for celebrities' children whose presence can enhance the institution's reputation. So, There are several elite social clubs that are mentioned and talked about within the text. And after World War II, many rich families started moving out to large suburban estates, and country clubs became frequent sites for family members offering a variety of social and recreational events. As you can see, as I have listed, one of those clubs is the Bohemian Club. And the Bohemian Club, actually, this is a picture from the very talk that your text talks about. That in 1995, George H.W. Bush gave a talk in which he described his son, George W., possessing the virtues that the United States needed that would qualify him to be a fine future president. Then, 4 years later, as the election year approached, his father brought him to the Bohemian Club again to meet many of his rich and powerful fellow club members who could provide substantial promotion and financial support for his run for presidency. So again, you see that constant combination between the upper class wealthy, even here in the elite social clubs, with presidential nominees, candidates, in order to basically kind of, in a way, buy what they would like in a president. And so for these social elite clubs, there are two most exclusive social clubs. Those are in New York City. That includes the Lynx and the Knickerbocker. And personal wealth is not the sole basis for attaining membership in these clubs. The individual and family must again meet the admissions committee's standards for values and behavior.